There's no way we'd fund a small business. Don't even think about coming back.
George said, looking me dead in the eye with a smug grin.
If you offer me a sincere apology on your knees right now, maybe I'll consider forgiving you. Go on, I'll watch.
He continued, grinning as if it were only natural for me to beg on my knees. But I'm not about to apology, and I was planning to reject the loan offer anyway. So I refused. Understood. Let's just forget about the loan, and I certainly won't be apology to you. My refusal to apology seemed to catch George off guard, and he looked at me with a puzzled expression.
Are you sure about this? Because of your ridiculous pride, your employees are going to be out on the street. Not that I care.
He pretends to care about the workers in my factory, but he doesn't give a damn. He's a real piece of work. Thanks for your concern, but you should worry about yourself. I'm telling you, you're going to regret pulling this stunt. My name is Marcus Miller. I'm 61, just past the age of 60. I'm getting on in age, but I'm still fully active. I'm the president of a small factory that I inherited from my parents, so I'm living a life with no concept of retirement. My only son isn't interested in the factory and has gone off to work somewhere else, so I don't currently have anyone lined up to take over. Among the 15 or so employees, there's one guy in his 30s. His name is Steve, and he's quite talented. He's motivated, and if he stays on until I retire, I'm thinking of handing the reins over to him. But I plan to work as long as I can, so that's more than 10 years away. Young folks today switch jobs too easily, so I'm not expecting too much. I'll worry about my successor when it's time for me to retire. When I inherited the company from my father, it was drowning in debt. Honestly, if I'd kept doing the same old thing, the business would have collapsed for sure. But I ran around borrowing from banks and managed to hold things together by starting a new business with that money. Now, even though we're small, we're known in the industry for our technical skill. We can produce anything on a large scale, but the small parts we can make are incredibly precise. For instance, we produce tiny components related to the valve system inside engines that laymen have never even heard of. Without those parts, you can't assemble an engine, and if these tiny parts are made carelessly, the quality of the final product is affected. Even errors of a few microns are unacceptable, and our factory is highly regarded in that respect. We owe it all to the craftsmen who have been with us since my father's day. In the US today, these small factory craftsmen are disappearing, and precision parts are becoming increasingly difficult to produce. It's a crisis for the US, a nation that developed through manufacturing. I'm proud to lead my team of craftsmen and serve as president of a manufacturing company in the US. Even if it's just a small business, I inherited the company when I just turned 30. The previous president, my father, had overworked himself trying to pay off debts and suddenly collapsed. Although he managed to survive, he was no longer able to work.
There's no way I can keep working. I'm just going to retire. We'll have to close the factory,
he muttered weakly from his hospital bed. I'd never seen my father so discouraged before, and I still remember how shocked I was. What are you saying? Wasn't that factory your dream? Get better and come back to work. Even as I tried to encourage him, my father kept talking negatively. The truth was, I'd already heard from the doctor that his condition would likely prevent him from returning to work, but the doctor had asked me to speak in a way that would give him some hope, so that's what I said. Still, there's no way words alone could convince my father to accept something that seemed impossible to anyone. I made up my mind to say the thing he would want to hear most. All right, then, I'll just take over the factory. Is that okay? I've always wanted to be president at least once. I tried to play it cool as I told him I'd take over. I felt embarrassed to say it earnestly, and I figured if I were too serious about it, my father would object. After all, The factory was saddled with a lot of debt. I know my dad scrambles for money at the end of every month, so he doesn't want his son struggling financially. But deep down, he doesn't want the factory to disappear, and he'd be thrilled if I said I'd take over.
You can't be serious about being the president. Don't joke around.
Despite his harsh words, my dad looked pleased. In the end, he reluctantly handed over the reins to me. I was working at a major foreign firm at the time, earning far more than I could ever dream of at an American company. So taking over as president didn't mean a pay raise. In fact, my disposable income plummeted, but it was more rewarding than I expected, because the parts we made at the factory were top-notch and something to be proud of. I knew with our quality, we could repay the debt and expand the factory, but it all depended on the new president, me. I committed to boosting our investments daily. Of course, things didn't always go smoothly. The debt was double what I had imagined, but it only motivated me further to repay it. 30 years have passed since I became president. The factory, once drowning in debt, is now paid off except for a single loan. That loan is with the Northeast National Bank, which initially lent to my dad and remains our main bank to this day. Keith Emerson, the loan officer of the bank and my age, was a close friend personally and professionally. So, whenever I needed a loan, I'd always consult Keith, and he'd do his best to secure the approval. Even when we didn't need the money, I'd sometimes still take out loans just to help bolster Keith's record. This spring, he finally reached retirement age. At 60, many companies indeed have a retirement age, but since I run my own business, the concept of retirement doesn't apply. When Keith came to give his retirement speech, I threw a tantrum about finding some way around it, but it was out of my hands, and he left as planned. The day before he retired, I applied for a $200,000 loan from the bank as a parting gift. Keith was thrilled, saying it was the best present, better than any bouquet. I was curious about my new loan officer. With our long-standing relationship with the bank, I wasn't worried they'd send over anyone unsuitable, but I was wrong. The new loan officer was a 35-year-old named George Keller. His youth wasn't the issue. It was his arrogant attitude. He claimed he was competent and acted like he was above everyone else. Customarily, he should have come with Keith to introduce himself, but he claimed he was too busy with other matters. I thought that was strange, but Keith reassured me, "I'll handle the transition properly." So I didn't worry. But when George finally showed up, he was clueless, saying things that made it clear he hadn't been briefed. When I asked if he had even gone over Keith's notes, he gave a ridiculous reply.
Keith left me a mountain of handover documents, but I haven't bothered to read them. I have my way of doing things. So what good would those papers do? Just so you know, I won't cut slack for small businesses just because of a long-standing relationship.
George may have his methods, and I don't expect him to mimic Keith, but completely ignoring his predecessor's notes is ridiculous. How about that attitude? A bank's clients are its customers, right? I admit I was helped by the loans, and it's not like I'm lording it over people because I'm a customer, but I was furious at his choice of words. You can't talk to me like that. I don't want to say this, but I've borrowed from your bank for decades. The bank makes a profit from those interest payments, yet you talk like that. That's too much.
Without our loans, small businesses like yours would have gone bankrupt long ago. Can't you see the bank clearly holds the upper hand? Don't get cocky and think you can challenge an elite like me.
What an awful way to speak. Even if he thought that, he shouldn't have said it. I wanted to argue back, but I knew if I did, it would just lead to an uncontrollable fight. I didn't want that, and I didn't want to embarrass Keith, his predecessor, either. So, I bit my tongue. When I stayed silent, George must have felt he won, and he threw even more insults at me.
I hear you quit a major international firm to take over this tiny factory. Since you worked at that big firm, I thought you'd be a high achiever. But turns out you're too dumb to do basic math.
Basic math? What do you mean? I shot back, and George, gloating like he'd scored a big victory, replied smugly,
Can't believe I have to explain this. You sure you worked at that big firm? Must have gotten in by mistake.
What do you mean by basic math? I asked again, as he kept mocking me. This guy really grated on my nerves. He just wanted to make me feel small.
Idiot. Comparing your international firm's salary to your pay as president here. It's obvious. Can't believe you can't do basic math. You're a fool.
It seemed George was simply comparing my pay now with what I earned at the international firm. When I worked there, I was in sales, and incentives were limitless. International companies reward you far more for what you earn than ordinary domestic companies ever would. I was probably earning several times, or even more, than my peers working at domestic firms. Sure, by comparison, quitting the big firm for this job might not seem like the smartest move, but is picking a job purely based on salary really the right way? I don't think so. Considering the job satisfaction, I took over the factory. I don't think my choice was wrong, even now. But if I explained that to someone who only thinks about salary, they'd just scoff. Yes, my salary has dropped significantly. You're probably right. Maybe I can't do basic math. I decided to take the high road and wrap things up calmly. George, pleased to have his opinion validated, smirked and left for the day. I was relieved to keep things under control, but felt extremely uneasy about dealing with George from now on. It felt like we might clash soon. I had a feeling like that, and it didn't take long for that feeling to come true. 2 weeks later, George stopped by the factory again, claiming he had a nearby client meeting. Since our last encounter, I hadn't seen George, though he'd called a few times, but his calls were pointless. He just wanted to belittle my small business. He constantly criticized my business and boasted that small businesses couldn't survive without the bank's help, then abruptly hung up the phone. I think he insulted his subordinates to release stress and boost his self-esteem. What a pathetic guy. So, when he showed up at the factory, I figured he'd just come to stir up more trouble. And I was totally right.
Working at your pathetic little factory again today, huh? Looks like your AC isn't working well either. It's so stuffy and hot. Even if you're short on cash, at least get yourself a decent air conditioner.
Our office where George is now wasn't hot at all. If we lowered the temperature any further, it would get too cold. In other words, he just wanted to bully. Every word out of his mouth was criticism aimed at me and my factory. He whined endlessly about being unlucky to be assigned to our place and how a high flyer like him shouldn't have to deal with a small business like mine. It was so pointless that I just let it wash over me. But George finally said something I couldn't ignore.
Seriously, the very idea of establishing a factory like this was stupid. Your dad started this place, right? Making employees suffer for his own satisfaction. What a jerk.
I can handle insults about myself, but I'm not the kind of person who can just laugh it off when someone talks badly about my father. Don't badmouth my dad. If you get too cocky, I'll drag you down to hell. When I suddenly barked at him, George seemed a bit startled, but the next moment, he was back to his usual snarky self and started making snide remarks again.
You realize what your position is, right? If my bank pulled out of your factory, you couldn't even pay next month's wages. I'm not wrong about your dad either. Apologize for mouthing off.
Not only did he refuse to change his stance, he even demanded an apology from me. But of course, I hadn't said anything wrong, so I had no intention of apologizing. Frankly, what George was saying wasn't even a problem of a banker. It was a problem of basic decency. I couldn't stand someone like him who could say such thoughtless things, and I was about to open my mouth to scrap the whole loan idea. But just then, he started talking about the loan.
So, you're not going to apologize, huh? Then let me tell you something. No loans for small businesses like yours. Don't come back to my bank again.
George looked me straight in the eye and said it smugly.
If you offer me a sincere apology on your knees right now, I might consider forgiving you. Go on, I'm watching.
His smirk said he fully expected me to grovel. Of course, I wasn't about to do that, and I was planning to refuse the loan anyway, so I flatly rejected his offer. All right, let's forget about the loan. It's a shame, since this was to celebrate Keith's retirement, but we're done here. George looked completely confused that I wouldn't grovel.
Are you sure about this? Your stupid pride will leave your workers on the streets. But hey, that's not my problem.
Thanks for your concern, but you should worry about yourself. Just so you know, you're the one fool regret this. When George stormed off in a rage, I closed the door after him. It was the first time I'd done something like that, but I really didn't want to see him again. The next day, I immediately went to the Northeast National Bank and told the teller I wanted to close my account. I had personally used the Northeast National Bank as my main account, so closing it was my declaration of intent. I had no desire to be involved with the Northeast National Bank ever again. When I asked to close my account, the teller looked surprised and went to the back of the bank. After a while, he returned with an older man in tow. I recognized the man. He was the branch manager of this bank, Thomas.
Marcus, I've just heard from our staff that you've requested to close your account. May I ask if something is wrong?
What's wrong is that I just came here to withdraw my money. Is it necessary to explain why I want to take back my own money? I was pretty angry, but my target was George. I didn't want to complain to the other people at the bank, so I planned to close my account without providing a reason.
No, it's not like that. But the amount you're asking for is substantial, so it'll take some time to prepare. Could I kindly ask you to wait in the back room?
There's no point in arguing here, so I headed to the meeting room as instructed. There, the manager kept asking me why I wanted to close my account. He probably feared that if my account were closed, he'd be under intense pressure from headquarters. His face was desperate.
Marcus, you and this bank have had a long-standing relationship. You're free to close your account, of course, but could you at least share your reasons? If there's any error on our part, we'll make it right.
In the face of his desperate tone, I finally let slip George's wrongdoing. The problem is with the sales rep. His remarks are so incredibly rude that I can't put up with them anymore. The manager was shocked and asked me,
What do you mean? Oh, speaking of which, the sales rep did change recently from someone who'd been handling your account for years. Who is it now?
I hesitated to name names because it felt like tattling, but I'd come this far, so I had no choice. It's a young guy named George. It's one thing to mock a small business, but he even spoke badly of my father. Nobody would stay quiet after hearing their parents insulted.
Of course. Please wait a moment. I'll call George now.
With that, the manager opened the door and instructed someone to fetch George.
Please bring George back immediately. He's on a sales call. This is more important. Tell him to come right now, no matter what.
It seemed George was out, but they'd passed on the urgent message to him. I thought it might be nice to cut ties after having a final word with George, so I waited. After all, closing my account was going to take a while, so it would pass the time. Before long, I heard frantic footsteps, and the door to the meeting room swung open. There stood George, breathing heavily. He was clearly panicked by the manager's urgent summons. He looked at me with a puzzled expression and spoke.
What are you doing here? You didn't go and tattle to the manager, did you? Thomas, you don't need to believe anything this small business owner says.
Even with the manager right in front of him, George's language toward a customer like me was unprofessional, to say the least. I watched to see how the manager Thomas would respond, and he was angrier than I'd expected, his face turning bright red.
How dare you say you to a customer? I had an inkling from what Marcus told me, but this is beyond my expectations. What kind of sales are you doing?
George looked like he knew he'd slipped up, but he couldn't take back his words. He seemed to brace himself and stick to his stance.
No, he's just a small business owner. Based on the size of our bank, we don't need to cater to this level of client. That's why I cut ties with him. If there's no relationship, is he really a customer?
In George's logic, it seemed I wasn't a customer. He thought he'd completely convinced the manager, but in the next moment, he was struck down.
What on earth are you talking about? Marcus is the customer with the highest account balance in our branch. If he closes his account, it could affect the very survival of this branch. Are you willing to take that responsibility?
The manager was so angry his lips were trembling.
What? How is that possible? A small business owner's account has the highest balance in our branch. There must be some mistake.
George seemed unable to believe what the branch manager was saying.
What did you take over from your predecessor, Keith? Wasn't it documented? Bring me the handover documents you received from Keith.
Thomas, the manager said. Initially, George made excuses about not knowing where the documents were, but after being scolded by Thomas, he reluctantly brought them. Thomas sighed as soon as he flipped to the first page of the documents.
It's all here on the first page about Marcus. This means you haven't even looked at the first page of the handover documents. Are you taking your job seriously?
At this point, George had no excuses left and turned pale. I glanced at the handover documents myself and saw my information highlighted in red as a top priority client. It was impossible to miss. George managed to mutter an apology to the manager.
I'm sorry. I had heard that Keith's clients were all small companies, so I assumed there was nothing of importance and didn't look through it. By the way, how much is in Marcus's account?
Hearing this, Thomas glared at George and replied,
That should be in the documents. Why don't you read them yourself?
George then looked at the documents handed to him and exclaimed in shock,
Well, $60 million. What does this mean?
In fact, I have personal deposits amounting to $60 million just at this bank. This was money I had saved from my salary, which was nearly $1 million when I was working for a multinational, and I had further increased it through investments. I don't really have any extravagant hobbies. Saving and investing could be considered my hobbies. That's why my money grew so impressively. In addition to deposits, my personal assets, including stocks and foreign currencies, exceed $100 million. When I took over from my parents, I already had several tens of millions of dollars in savings, but continuous investments multiply my personal wealth several times. Though I run a small business, my company's assets and my personal wealth are completely separate. There's absolutely no need to use my personal assets to cover any company deficits. The company itself started with a significant debt, but I enjoyed the challenge of gradually improving the company's financial health and paying off the debt. Of course, if the factory ever faced irreversible losses, I was prepared to use my personal wealth to provide severance for the employees. But fortunately, the company has been reducing its debt successfully since I took over. I've never really been financially distressed in both my personal and professional life. I continued my dealings with Northeast National Bank mostly out of respect for Keith, who had been kind to my father. Once George knew about my substantial personal wealth, his tone suddenly softened.
I had no idea you held such significant assets. Please tell me these things sooner. If I had known, I wouldn't have said those foolish things.
Just knowing I had money changed his attitude so drastically. I thought it was pathetic, but engaging him further seemed like a waste of time. Let's just end this. Just so you know, no matter what apologies you offer, I'm still closing this account. Could we hurry up with the procedure? As I urged the closure process, the manager offered me a sincere apology.
I'm terribly sorry for the distress George's actions have caused you. We will take strict action against him. Please, I beg you to reconsider closing your account.
While saying this, the manager made George sit next to him and forced him to apologize as well.
Aren't you going to apologize? Your actions have put this branch in a serious predicament.
Initially, George resisted apologizing on his knees, but the manager physically forced him down. Perhaps realizing the gravity of the situation, George started to cry. It was probably his first time kneeling, possibly due to a mix of regret and humiliation. He knelt down and stayed silent. So the branch manager told him to apologize, and he squeezed out some words of apology.
I'm really sorry. I said some awful things. I take them all back.
It's fine. I've decided to cut ties with this bank, so having you apologize doesn't matter. Just hurry up and close the account, no matter what was said. I didn't take back my decision to close it. In the end, the closure wasn't completed that day since the bank couldn't provide $60 million immediately. However, the branch manager later visited the factory to let me know the closure was done. He brought the $60 million, but still asked me to open an account one last time. I closed my account because I was furious with George's attitude. But I also think the bank that hired a man like him is responsible. If George's disciplinary action is settled, I might be able to deposit some of it. The branch manager was overjoyed to hear my words.
Of course, I wouldn't dare ask you to deposit the full $16 million. I just want to stay connected with you, Marcus. I'm so disappointed that we'd lose ties after trading together for so many years.
Even though I knew it was just politeness, it made me feel a little happy. The warmth in his words showed that he was speaking from the heart, at least a little bit. Some time later, I got a call from the branch manager.
As for George, various things have come to light through the investigation. He apparently engaged in many problematic behaviors with other clients besides you, Marcus. All of them were small businesses or mom and pop shops.
It seemed George was as rude to small businesses as he was to my company. Some places were even forced into providing hospitality with the promise of a loan. He specifically targeted those who couldn't manage without a loan, which made his behavior even worse. The branch manager learned this through careful interviews with George's clients. Even though he assured them the assessment wouldn't affect their loans, most of the clients were hesitant to speak up. The branch manager said George had used his influence to the point of near brainwashing.
I've been in banking for a long time, and I've never seen a banker this awful. He's definitely going to be fired. We'll investigate further and plan to compensate any clients who suffered financial losses.
George's firing was inevitable. Knowing this would prevent further harm, I felt relieved. But later, I heard that George had filed a lawsuit. Unhappy with being fired, worried, I reached out to Thomas.
Don't worry.
He laughed heartily as he said this.
It's true that we don't have much physical evidence of George's actions. None of the clients even thought of recording him because they were under his thumb. He probably thinks he has a good chance of winning the lawsuit.
Isn't that a problem? Even if George has no intention of returning to work, if the termination is ruled unfair, the bank might have to pay significant compensation. George probably didn't intend to return to work after all the trouble he'd caused. However, I felt his goal was to prove the termination was unfair and get compensation.
His goal is likely compensation, but there's nothing to worry about. We thoroughly investigated George and uncovered some shocking facts.
I could tell right away that he'd found something even worse than George's harassment of clients.
George had his hand in the bank's money, which is a serious crime. We're planning to countersue.
I see. That puts the bank at a clear advantage. I could already imagine George's face turning pale. I had no idea he was such a scumbag. Go after him with everything you've got.
You can count on it.
In the end, the bank filed a criminal complaint against George for embezzlement. George probably thought the lawsuit would give him an edge, but everything turned around against him. George panicked and contacted us to drop the criminal complaint if he withdrew the lawsuit. But that wasn't going to happen. In the end, the complaint was accepted, and George lost the lawsuit he filed himself, leaving him in a terrible situation. Naturally, he had to return the money he embezzled, but since it was around $200,000, he ended up with zero savings and had to shoulder debt too. To see the downfall of a guy who called himself an elite like this is almost laughable. He got probation for embezzlement at work, but then he got caught shoplifting at the corner store and ended up getting a prison sentence. He shoplifted a $1 chocolate. George claimed he did it because of the stress from losing the lawsuit, but he was the one who caused the case to begin with. There's no room for sympathy. In the end, George kept falling until now he's behind bars. I hope that once he gets out, he can change his ways and live honestly, but it's probably hard for someone like him. As for me, I took this opportunity to stop borrowing money from the bank. I wasn't struggling financially enough to need to borrow, but I did it to honor Keith's reputation, so it was a good chance. The factory's operations are stable, and sales are increasing. Steve, who I've been mentoring, recently got married and said he's happy to spend his career here, which was wonderful to hear. Maybe my retirement will come sooner than expected, and every day I search online for post-retirement fun. For some reason, this kind of daydreaming never gets old. Keith also reached out to me after hearing about this whole commotion. I'm sorry, Keith. I've decided to end my dealings with the Northeast National Bank.
Not at all. I'm the one who should apologize. It seems the handover wasn't smooth. Stopping the transactions is only natural, and I'm glad you did it because it's a good lesson for the bank.
Keith is really a great person. At that moment, I thought about opening an account again and depositing some personal funds once things calm down. It would help preserve Keith's reputation. From now on, I'm going to do everything I can to expand the factory before I retire. Sure, I have personal assets, but I want to build a foundation for the factory to thrive forever even after I'm gone. People live to be 100 years old these days. There's still so much life ahead.